This is the Pokemon PC. You're able to use it to hold Pokemon. But how did it change throughout the life of the games? And what other games can I store Pokemon in? Pokemon's own slogan is "Gotta catch 'em all." How true does that hold all these years later? Well, let's find out. Generation 1's Pokemon box was made by Bill and allowed the player to store up to 240 Pokemon in 12 boxes, each box holding 20 Pokemon. Though on the Japanese version you only got 8 boxes holding 30 Pokemon each, still totaling the 240, just a different box setup. Generation 1 introduced the first 151 Pokemon, giving the player almost 100 extra slots to work with. With no real competitive scene and shiny Pokemon not existing within the first game, you had plenty of space and you were almost never going to hit that limit. With the remakes of Fire Red, Leaf Green, they did introduce shinies, and you could store almost all of them again, only needing 62 extra spaces to store a complete shiny dex. Generation 2 gave us 14 boxes, and they're still able to hold 20 Pokemon each, but the maximum capacity has been increased to 280. The Japanese version of the game is a little weird. They get 9 boxes holding 30 Pokemon, totaling 270. For some reason, they get 10 less Pokemon than the other versions. With 100 new Pokemon added in the game, we are now able to store a total of 251 Pokemon. We're actually getting really close to the cap of Pokemon to the amount our boxes can hold in this game. If you wanted to keep a living dex, you would only have an extra 29 slots in the American version, and a measly 19 if it was the Japanese copy. Now, with the shiny Pokemon actually existing, you'd only have 29 slots to store them, so you better pick your favorites. Technically speaking, you can have 281 Pokemon. With the release of Heart Gold and Soul Silver, all copies of the game came with a Pokewalker. That let you put one Pokemon into it. That's it. And you could transfer it back to your game after going on a walk with it. However, if anything in your game changed, or it wasn't the original copy of the game, etc., etc., that Pokemon would be trapped in that Pokeball forever, never to escape the poor Pokewalker. Generation 3 decided that the difference between the JP copy and everyone else was weird, so they didn't do it. This PC has 14 boxes holding 30 Pokemon each, for a grand total of 420. Nice. From here on out, every box, minus a few exceptions I'll mention, hold a max capacity of 30 Pokemon. Ruby and Sapphire added an extra 135 Pokemon, bringing us to a total of 386. Once again, only leaving 34 slots after a living dex is complete. Luckily, this is the first game to have a separate storage from it. Pokemon Box Ruby and Sapphire was released as a separate game that you could play on the GameCube. And it was made so you could store more Pokemon. Though it works with Fire Red, Leaf Green, but they really want you to know this is for Ruby and Sapphire, and it also works with Emerald. With a whopping 1,500 Pokemon storage space, made up of 20 boxes holding 60 Pokemon each, this was a chunky boy. The game also came with a unique 59-block memory card to help you with your Pokemon storage, unless you were European, in which case you just got a normal card. Wah wah. You were also able to get some bonus eggs for filling up your boxes. You were able to get a Swablu, a Zigzagoon, a Skitty, and a Pichu. That is a lot of work for those Pokemon. Generation 4 saw more improvements upon our box storage capabilities. Now with 18 boxes holding the 30 Pokemon, you can now store 540 of them. Having added 107 Pokemon, we now need 493 slots to store our living dex, leaving 47 extra slots after we're done. Luckily, they got another game that's separate from this one to store our Pokemon. Pokemon Ranch is without a doubt the best version of storage they've ever made. You were able to store up to 1,000 Pokemon within this Wii game. The Pokemon could move freely around the ranch, and you could interact with them somewhat. See them race and build totem poles. It was neat. An update to the game raised the limit even more, up to 1,500. We're finally matching GameCube. You could also get unique Pokemon for filling out the ranch, just like the GameCube box. You were able to get a Fina and a Mew. One of these things is not like the other in terms of quality. Generation 5 switched it up again with the storage system. Now, storage base is stagnated. You would start with X amount unlocked, and unlock more based on game completion or boxes with Pokemon in them. This box started off with 8 boxes and finished at 24, still holding 30 Pokemon each. The new Pokemon count was 720, with Black and White adding 156 Pokemon, the most ever. We now need 649 slots to store everything. With only 71 slots remaining after getting a living dex, we're almost able to store the first generation of shiny Pokemon on top of everything else. Generation 6 was a bit crazy. Starting at 7 boxes, then going to 15, 24, and 30, and ending at 31. Still holding 30 Pokemon each, you can now store a max of 930 Pokemon. With 72 Pokemon out, our total required storage is now 721, leaving us with 209 open slots. We can now store the first generation as shinies on top of our living dex. The main reason for the stagnation was because of a tiny oopsie daisy that Nintendo made. You see, most people want to catch the legendary that's on the box. However, if you filled up your PC before fighting the legendary, you weren't able to catch the legendary because there just wasn't enough space. So, by stagnating it to where the last box opens up after you catch the legendary, you would always have a space for it and could actually catch it successfully. Sun and Moon had their boxes going from 8, 16, 25 to 32, giving us a max of 960. Adding in 88 Pokemon, we now need 809 for our living dex. We are left with 151, a significant decrease from Gen 6. Though, we can still hold exactly Gen 1 within the same game for our shiny dex and living dex. Let's go, Pikachu and Eevee woke up and decided they wanted to be different than every other Pokemon game. Then let's go, Pikachu, you got 1 box and it can store 1,000 Pokemon. You can hold every Pokemon in the game without really much of a problem. Sword and Shield storage system went from 8, 16, 25, 31 to 32, keeping us at their total of 960 Pokemon from the previous games. With 96 Pokemon added in, we now need 905 slots to complete our living dex, meaning we only have 55 extra slots to work with in this game, not enough to build the full shiny and normal living dex. Brilliant Diamond and Pearl has 18, 24, 30, 35, and 40 boxes respectively, absolutely flexing on all the other games, reaching a max capacity of 1,200 Pokemon. My goodness. If you only get Pokemon from the first 4 gens, you're able to complete a full shiny and living dex all in one storage system, with 214 slots still left for anything else. Legends uses pastures instead of boxes, but they're basically just boxes, and they go from 8, 16, 24, 30, 31, and 32, giving us a max storage space of 960 again. There's a total of 242 Pokemon in the game, so you're pretty much set with the limit. You can store all the Pokemon you want. Lastly, Scarlet and Violet has 8, 16, and 32 for their boxes, remaining at 960 Pokemon total. Adding in 120 new Pokemon for a complete living dex, you now need 1,025 box slots. It's here we finally pass a breaking point. In Scarlet and Violet, you as the player can physically not have a living dex anymore. You just simply do not have the space. You either need to store them in a previous game, or use one of the outside storage systems. But we'll get to that in a minute. There's just a couple more games to talk about that aren't actually mainline, but still have their own storage systems and let you store Pokemon and transfer them between. So, let's take a look at those to wrap this up. One of these extra games was Pokemon Coliseum, specifically the Japanese version. That one had 3 boxes, each holding 30 Pokemon, allowing you to store up to 90 Pokemon each. The other version of Pokemon Stadium, that Japan had again and everyone else, allowed you to have 12 boxes with only 20 capacity, giving a total of 240 Pokemon for you to store. Pokemon Stadium 2 gave us 14 boxes, holding again 20 Pokemon each, for a total of 280 Pokemon. The JP version had 9 boxes holding 30 Pokemon, for 270 Pokemon total. Once again, 10 less for some reason. I don't know why. Pokemon Coliseum had 3 boxes with 30 Pokemon total, allowing for a max of 90 Pokemon. Though, because of how the game worked, where there is no wild Pokemon and instead you catch shadow Pokemon from the evil team, you're not hitting that max through normal gameplay. Pokemon Gale of Darkness XD has 8 boxes with 30 capacity, allowing for 240 Pokemon. The same thing still applies because you still don't get wild Pokemon, and are once again catching Shadow Pokemon. Last but not least, we have Pokemon Bank and Pokemon Home. Pokemon Bank allowed you 100 boxes able to store 3,000 Pokemon total. Costing only $5 a year, it was really good. It closed down with the release of Pokemon Home. Luckily, if you had access to the eShop before that closed, you could get Pokemon Bank for free, and it allowed you to transfer Pokemon to Pokemon Home. Pokemon Home allows you to store 6,000 Pokemon for the cost of $15.99, oh my god. Without paying, you can only deposit 30 Pokemon, and you can't trade between Bank. So, if you had Pokemon Bank and need to move them all over, well, you're forking over some money to Nintendo. Now, for the tinfoil hat. Pokemon Home released alongside Generation 6 and X and Y, and ran up until Pokemon Home. During that time, Nintendo stopped increasing the box size limit. Coincidence? I think not. The only exception to this is Brilliant Diamond and Shining Pearl, who was made by LICA, not Game Freak. So Nintendo stopped increasing box size to encourage people to pay for the boxes in Home. Okay, tinfoil hat off now. Overall, Pokemon storage has changed a lot over the game's life. Starting off with very little space being added over time to pretty substantial jumps as the competitive scene and shiny hunting grew more and more popular, and then lulling itself into that 960 capacity that it's at now, with only a couple handful of games here and there actually going past that limit. Hopefully, in the next game, which is a Legends game, they increase the capacity again, so people can actually store the living decks like they used to. Because as of right now, you can't without paying or having another entire game just to do it.